Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you for not running for the hills because the boring accountants have just rocked up onto the stage. I'd like to thank you for giving us this opportunity to come and talk to you about our perspectives on the esports industry and its direction of travel on this particularly beautiful, sunny Birmingham day. This is sunny for Birmingham, by the way, for those of you that are not from this area. I'm Andy Fay. I'm a director in People and Organisation in London, and I've been looking at esports probably for about 12 to 18 months now, but really over the last 6 months or so with quite a lot of vigour, should we say. I lead our UK practice in esports, and I also chair our global network, bringing together all our expertise across lines of service and different countries together on esports. And therefore, I'm delighted to say that some of our European colleagues are with me today, apart from Adam on the far end, who's from the UK. So we've got Morgan Furby, partner from Sweden, a corporate tax partner. Got Mette Muller from Denmark, who's in People and Organisation as well. Clive Reeves from Switzerland, who is British, but he is genuinely, I promise you, from Switzerland at the moment. And Adam Edelshane on the end there as well, who's from London. I think before we get into some of the or sort of perspectives that the colleagues here can provide, as I said, I've been looking for a few months now, just over a year at esports, and there's this sort of burning desire that I come across quite often to always compare esports to traditional sports. And I certainly get there's an element of frustration sometimes when that happens, that we're comfortable when something can be aligned and is obvious that it can be compared to. It's not a bad thing. There are definitely some learnings from traditional sports that can work both ways with esports. But also, it's true that there isn't really an industry out there that is the same as esports. There is no parallel that you can draw with something that is in existence. So there's not necessarily a need to try and make it fit with anything that already exists. It is what it is. But if you break it down into various segments, you can align the esports industry with many other industries. Things can be learned, for example, oil and gas, how you contract with your players, employees. There's some similarities with that industry. It was mentioned in the previous panel about gambling. What can be learnt about regulation when that eventually will come in on the esports industry? What can we learn from the gambling sector? Retail around transfer pricing, which is an issue already in esports, and the list can go on and on and on. But traditional sports, isn't perfect itself. That's continuously being evolved. Football, if football had its time again, would it have FIFA at the top and would it be structured in the way that it is? Probably not. If you look at rugby union, that's consistently being evolved all the time because it hasn't settled yet on a model that is really delivering. So it's not a bad thing that the ecosystem in esports at the moment is what's termed fragmented. Maybe that's the right thing in the long term. It's about making the best use of what it is at the moment and capitalizing on some of those opportunities that were previously raised. So I think that's quite a good place to start with a sort of learning from other industries. So maybe if we start with Adam and Clive on where some trends exist currently in, say, media and entertainment, which is where Adam specialises in, and traditional sports background Clive has. Are there any trends at the moment that esports can benefit from, do you think?
Thanks, Andy. So, I'm an entertainment and media specialist, and I've been looking at the sector for the last 10 plus years. And PwC produce a 5-year forecast across 13 segments, now 15 segments of the entertainment and media industry, and look at what are the key driving trends that are going to change revenue in those sectors. And I thought that the three most relevant and interesting ones that linked in with esports were first of all, around user experience. So critically, the user experience is one of the most important things to focus on across the E&M sector at the moment, largely because of the importance or demand and the power that sits with the audience around the determination for personalization of content, and the availability and choice of which is effectively making an increased demand for quality in the content that they're consuming, because they have so much other choice. So if something's not quite up to scratch, they can easily move elsewhere. The second key trend is around mobile. It was touched on in the last session. I think across the board, we're seeing a huge growth in mobile across the whole of the entertainment and media sector. And we're fully expecting that to also take place in esports. Not sure, though, yet the extent to which it'll happen both on a gaming side and then on the viewing side. So that, for me personally, the jury's out as to how quickly it'll continue to grow in both of those two segments. And then finally, it's around technology. Technology has continued to enable rapid growth of some of the entertainment and media sectors and facilitated the decline of some of the staple industries like newspapers and others. And so the question mark is, where is the next technological development going to come that's going to enable that extra innovation and grow the sectors? And esports has benefited significantly from that technological change. And for me, the question is, where else is the innovation going to come that's going to help drive the sector?
Clive?
Thank you, Adam. Firstly, great to be here and share some insights with you today. So thank you for having us. So my background, very quickly, was in the professional sports industry. I moved into consulting more recently. I sit within the strategy and operations team in Switzerland. I agree, I only moved there a few months ago. But I'm going to try and share with you some of the insights from the traditional sports world and try and make a link for you in terms of why I think they're relevant for you today. Like Adam, we survey the sports industry every year and try and gauge a perception of what they think are some of the key drivers and key trends that are happening. So in terms of last year's survey, 2017, interestingly, on a growth perspective, the industry felt like it was starting to potentially cool off a little bit. They've had quite high growth rates over the last few years, and they feel like that's beginning to cool off. But three areas they identify, or three sports, if you like, they identify as being the key growth ones were actually football, esports, and then basketball in that order. So I think that just shows you already where the sports industry is starting to look at esports and go, no, this is right on everyone's radar and is seen as a very high growth area. The reason why I started with growth in the sports industry, and that's potentially cooling off and when we're seeing in the TV rights deals and so forth. And the jury's out whether we're reaching a tipping point or not, but it's certainly there's disruption starting to happen. And I think that's why investors and sports teams are starting to look to diversify in terms of what they do and the markets they're in. And I think that's why you're starting to see more interest in the esports space from a traditional sports perspective. I think another sort of trend or a key finding as we're seeing is the changing in the consumer behaviour. Clearly, as has been touched on many times today, attracting a younger digital native audience is key, and some of the traditional sports are finding that challenging, and that will be a challenge to the sports sector moving forward, and one where esports has an advantage potentially in the way it's structured and the way it's grown thus far. Another disruption that's happening, which is very interesting, I think, is in the media space. We're seeing a challenging of the traditional broadcaster. The traditional broadcasters are starting to be challenged from the digital companies, from the tech companies. We're seeing a changing in viewing habits, and that's generally going to change the way sports properties essentially go direct to consumer, which we're seeing in OTT platforms. So essentially in the sports space at the moment, I think we're seeing a huge amount of disruption, lots of change happening. And the reason why I share that today and start the panel with that is I think esports is in a really good place to capitalise on some of that. We're seeing the convergence of sport, media and entertainment coming together, and esports could have a really critical place in that ecosystem, even more so than it does today. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity and one that we're keen to kind of explore further today. So I think that's a couple of starting points.
Before we move on, if anybody has any questions, please use the app, or I'll just open it up for the floor at the end. Building on what you two have just said, if I just stay with you for a sort of a follow-up, with that in mind, what are the current opportunities and growth potential that the esports industry sector has over the next 2-5 years and beyond?
Yeah, I'll start with that. My view is that at the moment we're seeing sponsorship as one of the biggest revenue areas for esports, and I think to truly achieve its potential, we're seeing predictions of growth rates of 20% year on year in a number of different places. But to truly achieve that, it's going to be really important to be able to capitalize on and work out how you're going to get the engagement of the consumers, the guys that are going to be forming that esports audience, and understanding what it is that they want, what it is that they need, and then tailoring the way in which you go to market to make sure you give them something that they can enjoy and they're willing to spend money on. Because ultimately, it's going to be monetizing that huge potential audience that's going to really enable esports to reach its potential. And I look at some of the entertainment and media sectors. I used to be a journalist, and ultimately, from an advertiser perspective, when you were looking at traditional media, it was impossible to really know whether you were reaching your audience because you had such limited data and information about that audience. And therefore, you were guessing in many ways as to how you could tailor your content to really meet the needs of that audience. And even still, you've got a lot of newspapers that are producing content, not because that's what the audience wants, but that's because that's what they want to tell the audience. And you're seeing certain businesses really struggle to adapt to this market where audience has a lot more of the power. And the businesses that are succeeding are the ones that are adapting to the needs of that audience. And the key question for me is, how do you do that? So how do you adapt to the needs of that audience to try and make sure you capitalize on it? And for me, it goes back to what was touched on the other panel just before, around truly understanding that audience. So that's demographics, so that you can target it. But it goes deeper than that. It goes to engagement and truly understanding what engagement means. So one of the things I've been exploring recently is, how do you measure engagement? It's quite a loaded word. And what matters in terms of trying to enable that deeper connection with your audience and ultimately enable you to kind of grow as an industry and monetize effectively. And I think I'd probably touch on kind of 3 key metrics which for me make the most difference. One is frequency. So how much of that audience is coming back again and again and again? Really, really important. The second one is around dwell time. So you may get people coming in and out for 20, 30 seconds. You may get people coming and sitting down and engaging with your content for hours on end. Obviously, they're very, very different levels of engagement and represent different value to all sorts of different players in the marketplace. So understanding the nature in which people are engaging with your content is really, really important as well. And then the final one, which is the most difficult to measure, an accurate measurement of all of this is one of entertainment and media's biggest problems. So I'm sure esports is going to struggle in the same battle. Although you have a lot more data than some of the traditional businesses do. And that last metric is around loyalty or trust. It goes back to the user experience I touched on before. If you've got a good user experience, you're going to retain some degree of loyalty and trust in your audience and your consumers. But how can you build a brand where they come back not just for one game, but your other games that you want them to enjoy and consume? How do you retain their trust as a team to make sure that you're meeting the needs of that fan base of that team, supplying them with all the things they need and want from you as a team? or as an individual streamer. So it's about, for me, the opportunity is there. It's about making the most of that opportunity by understanding the needs of that audience, which is a massive challenge because, as has been previously mentioned, it can be extremely fragmented and people can want very different things.
No, I totally agree with that. And the session before as well, there's some very good points there around how to engage the audience, being authentic, and how you communicate. And I think sport's going through that journey exactly the same as we speak. So I think that's just a shift in society today in the way we communicate with our audiences. I think the point I would make here is around how you capitalise and leverage the different stakeholders that are entering esports. There's a huge amount of expertise and knowledge in the industry already. But when you look at the types of brands that are entering, the types of investors, and again, with a slight sports bias, the sports investors now that own teams in different leagues and different industries, I think how you capitalise on that expertise and really use that to grow the industry and grow your business is actually critical at this stage. And I think with that starts to drive then the strategy you can approach in this really dynamic space, which is changing all the time. I think one of the earlier panels said 2 years ago this would never have been dreamed of. So let's think about what the next 2 or 3 years looks like. It's going to be really hard to predict. So I think it's trying to maximise what expertise is coming into or wants to come into the industry to help and support, through investors, through brands, and through media companies and etc., tech companies, and really use that skill set to drive your business, whether that's a league, a team, an agency, and so on. I think that's going to be the critical thing for me, is really utilising the skill set, using that to drive your strategy, structure your business in the right way to capitalise on the opportunities that are there. So I think it's a really fast-moving space to pin it down to one thing, probably other than really understanding that audience and how you can engage them and capitalise on that loyalty. Yeah,
I think it's important to note as well that we as PwC, we are quite late to the market. We're very appreciative that this has been going on for 18 odd years, but we're learning all the time. So these are very much, our perceptions, or we're drawing analogies with other industries or where we may have seen similar things in the past. So we're learning all the time. We don't have all the answers, absolutely. There'll be far more knowledge in this room on the whole of esports than what we have, but what we can give is a bit of a different perspective. The one thing that certainly doesn't change is rules and regulations and tax and all the boring stuff that people choose not to think about quite often. So if I open it up now to Morgan and Meta, what are the current trends, Morgan, perhaps if we start with you, that you see in the world of tax throughout Europe in particular, that esports need to be aware of going forward?
Well, working with tax within the corporate sector, coming into the esports sector, it's easy to get a bit nervous. I'm working with some of the Swedish teams, some of the Swedish players. We also work quite closely with DreamHack. So I think we know the Swedish scene quite well. But I think we should be aware of the international perspective, because going back 10 years, everyone considered tax as a cost. But at that time, you tried to reduce tax with all means in any way. That's not the case any longer. So I think we have to look at tax a bit more differently today. And it also means we need to have other perspectives. And I think we have the media perspective. The business media in Sweden, they love tax scandals. I know the UK media is not very nice either. If you're looking for sponsors, or if you are having sponsor, especially if the sponsors are not really within the pure esport business, they will be afraid, they will run off. So this is quite difficult. I think also looking at sponsors coming from outside the esport area, they will put more focus on how to handle tax. They will look at other things as well. How are you dealing with your people? But tax is one side. And we still also have the tax agency in Sweden and all around the world. I would say they are not up to speed yet. They don't understand the industry. They don't understand what happens. So when they do understand, there will be questions. So why not try to be compliant before that? I think it's important. And it's not different with esport than any other industry. We all have the same problems. But in my view, the esport questions, they are dealing with cross-border transactions, quite modern payment methods, and really a lack of best practice. Well, I could maybe say that there's a lack of financial and legal infrastructure. It might be a bit hard, but it also be a bit true. So what are the learnings, and why is the handling of tax important? You have the commercial side. You must be really careful with your sponsors. It's not easy to get new ones. We have also seen in Sweden another difficult thing, and that's basically about fair competition. The team that I work with find it difficult to do right because it will cost you a lot, because tax is a cost. Then you can pay your players less money, and then the players decides to go to the other teams, which are basically not that compliant. That's not fair competition. I also think we need to bring in the people perspective, looking from a grassroots perspective. I met an influencer yesterday. She's 22 years old. She has made 1 million Swedish crowns. That will be approximately 100,000 UK pound in a year. She had no idea that she should pay tax. And she asked me, do I have a problem? No, it's no problem making money, as long as you do some formalities as paying tax. Well, the money's gone, I've spent it. Well, then you have a problem. And that, I think, is quite significant for a lot of young people coming into this, making a lot of money, but they have no one to ask, they don't know what to do. And that's really not a good start.
I think that's a really valid point. I think it's not to say that by putting lots of frameworks, regulation and structures around everything is what the answer necessarily is. The answer probably isn't anywhere near that. The answer is probably having a broad understanding of what the issues are and understanding what risks that are being taken and how tall your risk profile is and how risky you want to be. But then also leveraging and leaning, as I said earlier, on other industries where there are similarities. So I very much see, the way people employ their players or contract with their players. There's similarities with oil and gas there. Oil and gas have riggers sat all over the world, and they get pulled onto oil rigs for short periods and then they go back home. They all have a big employer in Shell or BP or whoever it may be. So there are similarities. So they're able to get over these hurdles of contracting with their players, and esports eventually will as well. But to Morgan's point at the moment, and it's probably because it has grown so fast over the last couple of years, is that the infrastructure isn't necessarily there to support it just now, but it can be put in place relatively quickly. I guess with that in mind, Meta, maybe one for you. Esports, as I said, over 2 or 3 years has grown really, really fast. And a lot of organizations, such as PwC, are catching up with it. Eventually, governments and tax authorities are also going to catch up. And without giving any clues to any government officials that may be in the room, what are the sort of problems on the horizon potentially for some of these organizations?
Yeah, I come from Denmark, and we take esports very seriously. Because, for example, our Prime Minister, he greeted Astralis when they won on tweet. He sent a tweet. And I've been involved in quite a lot of communication during the last couple of years. And it's been with the chief gaming officers. It's been with good players and their parents. It's been with the team managers. And one thing I learned is that they know nothing about taxation when it comes to the young people. And the parents are, of course, very, very worried. I talked to a guy who had earned, I think it was $269,000 last year. We have a deadline for tax returns on 1st of July, he didn't file any tax return yet. And he hasn't touched the money because he's so afraid. He doesn't know what to do, and his mother was even more afraid. So I think what we can bring to the market is that it's not different from anything else. You need to know what to do. A tax return is a tax return for everyone. So if when I talk to the young ones and their parents, I get like a tax psychologist, because we need to understand that I've gained something from society, now I pay something back, and it's not a catastrophe. But for example, my son, I talked to him and he talked to me about all these people streaming, that they pay half of their salary to whatever it was, the platform. And then I told them, yes, and then they need to pay some taxes. Oh, that's unfair. They have already paid half of their fee to these. Yeah, but that's how it works, my dear. Everybody needs to contribute. So it's a way of thinking that we need to implement in the industry, that we need to help the young ones, and they know nothing about contracts. I've seen contracts where they try to tell the young ones they are consultants. Consultants, from a tax perspective, you're not a consultant if you're paid for. Everything is paid for you when you travel, when you book hotels, when you go to a competition. Then you're really an employee because someone is taking care of you. And that someone will be very, very unhappy when they find out that they have a huge debt that nobody, as you told, no, I've just spent the money. Well, honey, then you go to jail. That's it. Because that's the end of that story. So there's a need for maturity now. And it's the grown-ups that needs to take this on. It's not the young ones. They just have a huge trust in who they work for, the team managers and so on. And I've seen it with sports people. I've seen it with music, pop musicians. They believe that someone is taking care for them, but that's not really what happens right now.
I think it's ever more important when we see that the Epic Games are putting $100 million aside for Fortnite competitive gaming prize money, and I think the UK there's a 13-year-old professional Fortnite player. So the alarm bells start ringing. If 100 million is going to be shared among a few, then the tax man is going to have keen, close eyes on how that is being administered. There are other broader issues that are very apparent that a lot of people seem to struggle with. Is immigration is a key problem for moving people quickly to start competing in various competitions. Bringing Russians at the moment into the UK or anywhere else can prove pretty problematic. Going into China, you need quite a decent amount of lead time in order to get the appropriate papers to go and compete there. You can do it, but there are time frames that is required in order to do that. So again, you can leverage off other industries. How do they go about doing things quickly and efficiently? Esports aren't on their own when it comes to having to get somebody at a short notice into another country. So there's lobbying that can be done with various governments and officials in order to get certain events and competitions almost waived for visa purposes and such like. But in order for that to happen, there has to be a collective drive within the industry, usually probably led by the teams, with putting pressure on publishers to get this sort of collaborative approach with various authorities. One of the other problems, sort of building on Meta's point there, is that a lot of tax legislation that is in place in various jurisdictions, Social Security as well, was written years and years ago when, before the internet even existed. So how can you possibly put that over the current esports ecosystem? It won't fit. So, but the governments and the various fiscal authorities, that won't wash. Something will have to get paid over. It just will have to get figured out what and how much. And that will differ from country to country. And the first thing that I learned when looking at esports was that the second you're in it, the second after that, you are global. And with that, you can't fix a problem only within your four walls of your jurisdiction, because you potentially will create a problem somewhere else, or the solution you've used for one jurisdiction just simply won't work on a global scale. So those teams in particular that have a global reach of players dotted all over the world, it's impossible to get one size fits all. There has to be some innovation and creativity around how they go about their structures and processes, etc. I guess then sort of for all of you, as a sort of a closing question before we've got loads of questions on the app, I'm sure you'll be pleased to know. What do you see as some of the challenges facing maybe some of the areas you've spoken about or that you'd like to cover for esports as a whole to meet some of those really attractive growth targets?
So we touched on the importance of understanding the audience, and I think the big challenge there is getting reliable and trustworthy data around the size of the audience, and then the demographic data that breaks down into, and whether the pools of data that you're collecting are representative of your audience. And then looking at those measures of engagement. And given the various ones I mentioned earlier, there's lots of different types, and it's really difficult to get a good, trusted pool of data around engagement that you can then make decisions off the back of it. So looking to make sure that you can get that data and make sure you can trust that data to make decisions is going to be really critical. I'll just touch on one of the other critical challenges that I see coming across from the media sector specifically, which is around the advertising side. So we touched on consumer engagement. On the advertising side, there'll be some of the same challenges we're seeing more broadly. So things like brand safety. So brands being nervous around being associated with some first-person shooter esport games. That putting something in place that can give them the comfort that if they're going to engage in advertising associated with that they can be comfortable and safe associated with the types of games that they want to be associated with, that will put certain minds at rest and help the growth. I think viewability is another critical one. At the moment, the esports community very, very switched on around use of ad blockers, and from an advertiser's perspective, you want to be able to reach that audience and you want to make sure they've seen your advertising. If everyone's switching it off, you're not getting what you want. And even still, when they're not switching it off, are they actually seeing the ads? And are they paying attention? Are they focusing on that in the way that you want them to? I think we did a study about a year ago around attention and focus alongside Newsworks. And the conclusion there was so many people are not focusing on a single medium at any one time anymore. It's 2, 3, more than that at any one time. So there's a real question mark as to whether you're getting the focus that you expect or want from an advertiser's perspective, and whether that's then generating or the results that you want from that advertising campaign. So brand safety, viewability on the advertising front, and then finally ad fraud. So, are the platforms of which esports is being played out on, are they giving the advertisers the comfort that the systems and processes and controls that underpin the serving of those ads, that they're doing so in a way that protects those advertisers from ad fraud? Those are kind of a few of the major challenges on the advertising side, on top of the ones that I touched on the consumer side.
Great. And to add a few more to that, so I think the interesting one is around how do you structure your business in the dynamic space we're in. I think that's a real challenge going forward. I think, like I said earlier, 2 years ago this wouldn't have happened. In 2 years' time, who knows what it looks like? So I think how do you, from a business perspective, how do you manage your organisation to adapt with the change? I think is a real challenge. And I think we're seeing that in the sports sector with changing consumer behaviour. As I said earlier, they're having to shift their strategy and their business models to adopt to that. And perhaps some of the more traditional sports are being slower than perhaps other industries may be, esports being one of them. I think there's another one around sort of integrity of the competitions. I think it's slightly touched on earlier, but we look at where betting is in sport and what's happening in the US now with betting becoming legal in certain states. I think that's going to increasingly be prevalent in esports. I think the third one is, as the revenues grow and the prize monies grow and the stars earn more money, I think as a team level, how do you become profitable or break even at least? And how do you manage your business around that with the number of athletes you have around the world earning significant sums of money? I think that brings complexity and challenge to any business. And I think if you look at the journey football has been on over the last 15 years in terms of players' salaries alone, it's astronomical figures now. And with that comes challenges on a player level, on a business level, and a commercial level, which then increases the pressure to get sponsorship revenue and that sort of thing. So I think another point on the sponsorship revenue would be trying to diversify where your income comes from. I think again, if football is an example, a lot of the teams are still solely dependent on the huge TV deal, and that's a real risk for their business, I think, going forward. If that TV deal was to change in any way, that's a lot of money you've got to earn through sponsorship or other means to keep at the current rate of spending, and that could be a challenge for esports going forward as well, I think.
Anything to add on some challenges?
Well, I think in the Swedish perspective, there's quite an important challenge, and that's basically esporters as athletes or not. I know in different countries considered as athletes, in Sweden, not. So I think that is, it makes it a bit difficult. So that's on the, so to speak, the playing, the team aspects. And then I could mention some possibility, an option, and that's basically the education in Sweden. From you are 15, you are able to study to an engineer, and also come out as a professional gamer. I think it's really, really good education focus on esports. So I think we will see a lot of really, really good gamers coming out being 17, 18 years old. Remember I said that.
Yeah. I think just one more observation before we go to some of your questions is I see one of the big advantages that esports have is monetizing the viewer is a key one, and certainly some anecdotal feedback that I've had from potential investors in teams and other organizations in the industry has been that they're desperate to invest. They're on the sidelines seeing that this is a really exciting market, particularly, sports stars and other famous individuals who have cash to burn. But their one reservation at the moment is no one can give them a guarantee that the viewer will be monetized. If that was to be more favorable, or certainly the view or the outlook was more positive that was going to happen, I think we'd see a lot more private investment come into the industry. Not to say people aren't investing, of course they are, but it's that previous panel said about understanding the risk, understanding the details before you go in. You're more likely to invest, and the minute that's the one stumbling block that I see regularly. And then we talked earlier about frameworks and governance, etc. Without putting a big structure around it that really puts people off, there is something around knowing your clients, knowing your people, knowing your teams and who's playing. And again, sponsors, big brands need that reassurance that the various checks have been put in place for competing teams and players on their sort of background checks. But just to go to some of these questions, as we've got about sort of 5 or 6 minutes. The first question, which I'll take because it's kind of in my area, is Brexit. Will Brexit impact events coming to the UK? My view is no, it wouldn't. And the reason I say that is because even if you look tomorrow, the competitors playing tomorrow are from non-EU countries, the majority. They have to get visas, paperwork, etc., to come to the UK where required. The UK, whatever happens after Brexit, whatever papers, clearance requirements will need to come into the UK, it will be part of the process. And that's not just an esports thing, that is a cross-industry issue that people still don't know the answer to, but when an issue's been put in front of people, they just overcome it. So I think no is the answer to that. Particularly if, tomorrow, and I've got no doubt will be a big success, I think there'll be a clamour for more events to come to the UK. One question, interesting one, around traditional sports, and maybe one for you, Clive. Do you see traditional sports teams getting more value from acquiring the IP by things like buying existing teams or growing their own teams centrally?
Firstly, that's a great question. So this year on our survey, we're actually asking that to the sports market. So that's a very good question. I think it depends on the strategy of the team. Essentially, I think you're seeing in traditional sport now a range of different ways teams or organisations are essentially dipping their toe in the water to see how they want to go about things. So I think you're seeing certain types of ownership groups who own sports assets, who are investors trying to build media entertainment companies, essentially. They seem to be going down an acquisition route, I think. But then I'm seeing other teams that are possibly looking at building in-house capabilities and doing it that way. So I think there's probably not a set strategy teams are going to go down. But I think with the invention of the NBA 2K League, the FIFA leagues that are coming, I think a lot of sports teams may take that as the obvious first step, and then see how that can grow out into the more established traditional esports titles. So I think at the moment, sports on the sidelines looking in and gradually making their moves, but probably taking it slower than they would. Because again, it's like the rest of us. It's understanding the ecosystem, understanding the right approach for them as an organisation, and looking at how they can really maximise their skill sets to add value to the industry, and also look at how they can benefit from it longer term as well. But I think sports teams, as our survey showed last year, in terms of esports, is high on their priority list. I still think we're in a phase of understanding and of strategising what is the right approach to take. So I do think you'll see more acquisitions probably as a start point, but eventually you may see some more organic grow your own teams as well.
I think that one of the issues that we've seen as well with sport teams coming in, and some of the meetings that we've had that have touched on esports, is that there's a lack of understanding of the industry and what esports is. For them, esports is FIFA, and people playing FIFA and their team having a FIFA representative, etc., which no doubt there is a place for it, but there's a sort of a general feeling that they need to think a bit more why they want to get into esports before they do it, and think that the solution is merely to put somebody in a Manchester United shirt and playing FIFA. It's probably not the answer. So that's interesting. One, Adam, one for you, probably a final question. Actually, no, we'll do two more. And I don't know if you know the answer to this, but you may do. Online marketing, do you have any insight into general click-through rate trends? Or are you seeing a general trend towards click-through rates dropping? Perhaps this is something about your engagement of advertising, etc.
Yeah, I think in terms of click-through rates, I'm not sure I have the stats to, and I'd probably have to go and look some of this up around click-through rate trends specifically. I do think that there's a less of a focus, though, now on click-through rates as a measure of success for advertisers, and a realization that there's a lot of other things that they can be looking at as an alternative in order to assess the effectiveness of their campaigns. I think it was wonderful when suddenly they had access to all this data on the number of people that were clicking on their ads and going, oh, goodness gracious, yeah, we're definitely interacting with these brands, interacting with our consumers, and we can measure it in exact terms. And then there was the sort of realization that that was only a part of the story, and actually that even in itself wasn't necessarily a great guide to the extent to which people were connecting with the brand. So while I can't comment explicitly on the numbers around click-through rates, I certainly say that there's a realization that it's not the be-all and end-all in terms of judging the effectiveness of a campaign.
Thanks, Adam. And one final question, perhaps for you two. What are the most likely tax efficiencies for esports teams, players, event organisers, and are these significant? Can we tax plan?
But tax planning is a bad word. So it's more like finding the right rules for the right people. So you could say nearly every country has a way of treating employees in a special way where they have reduced rates. So this route going down, pretending to be a consultant, is as I see it, a stupid way because it makes things very difficult for everyone. And if teams generally go for these expert tax rules in each of the countries, then I think we can reduce rates generally.
I think I agree, basically, because being paid with salary, it's always high taxed, unfortunately. But you could always try to be the owner of the team. That could be better, at least in Sweden.
I think just one final point to close off on that. The same with anything, any tax planning, etc. If you have time to do it and some thought behind it, you're likely to get a much more favourable result, particularly as you'll be able to be compliant and also manage your tax as efficiently as possible. So thank you for listening, and I believe it's a break now, am I right?
Right, thank you so much. Can we get a round of applause?